Welcome to Who Shaves the Barber, a weekly podcast where we explore paradoxes, thought experiments, and other pointless problems. I'm William Nava. It has recently occurred to me that I've been doing this podcast and doing other philosophy-related work, and I haven't really done anything explaining why I'm doing that, which I think would be a reasonable thing for somebody to be curious about. And so I thought I'd do a series of episodes kind of tackling my own perspective in this sort of philosophical project that I'm engaged in. And I'm going to do it in two parts. So this is the first part, and this is going to be about the question, why do philosophy at all? There will be a slight emphasis on my own, why do I do philosophy? Why am I doing the work that I'm doing in particular? But I'm going to attack it as a general question. Why should anybody practice philosophy? Why does anybody practice philosophy? And then here and there, and then especially towards the end, I'll kind of hone in on how some of those general insights apply to me. And then in a second part, an episode about my own philosophical outlook, right? So this first part is about why do philosophy, and then the second part is, I've discussed various different philosophical issues, and I've interviewed a number of philosophers. I haven't really put forward anything like a worldview of my own. So that's what I want to do in that second part, to kind of put together all the different parts of the various things that I'm interested in and engaged in, and show how they're part of a unified philosophical outlook and a unified philosophical project. I'm partially interested in doing this first part, this why do philosophy at all part, because I sense that there's a kind of perception in popular culture that philosophy is this really very hyper abstract and very removed field that has no real pragmatic use. And so I think the question of why practice philosophy at all is one that probably a lot of people actually don't have a good sense of. Why would you engage in such a seemingly useless enterprise as philosophy seems to be? So that's something that I very much want to address in this episode. Now, a quick disclaimer. This is not a topic that I have researched. I'm kind of going off of my own intuitions here. So sometimes I present something and I do my homework. I want to make sure that I'm giving you a kind of informed opinion that it takes into account what experts might say on this topic. I'm sure there are experts on the topic of why somebody would do philosophy. However, when it comes to this particular topic, I haven't done any research. I'm giving you my own thoughts on it, pretty raw. So take that for what it will. I hope you find it interesting and engaging anyway. Now, I think the first thing that I have to address, if I'm going to talk about this, is I do have to address what is philosophy, right? If I'm going to talk about why do philosophy, we first need to get somewhat clear on what philosophy is. Now that is in itself a whole big question. I could do a whole episode on just the topic of what is philosophy, but that would take me away from what I want to discuss, which is why do philosophy. So I'm not going to go very deeply into the question of what is philosophy. I'm just going to say a couple of things about it so that we can kind of refer to that when necessary. But this is not intended to be a definition of philosophy or to encompass everything that philosophy is. It's really just something to get our footing ready for the real meat of what I want to present here. So what is philosophy? First of all, I would just to reiterate, I will not be stipulating a precise definition. I want to make the claim that if you are watching this, then you probably know what philosophy is. But I will say that one of its defining characteristics is that philosophers tend to look for very general and abstract explanations, right? I think, again, this is not meant to define philosophy, but I do think that it does a fairly good job of describing a fairly important characteristic. So let's say that you see a tiger and you might ask a question like, hey, look, there's a tiger. What are tigers like? Now you could generalize that and say, well, why don't I just ask what animals are like in general? Okay, well, why not just ask what are living things like in general? Okay, what are physical objects like in general? What is anything like in general? What does it mean for something to be anything at all? What does it mean for something to be the precise thing that it is? Is it something different from just being anything at all? You can see I've gone from something quite specific, asking about what tigers are like, and upped the generality to talk about this, very abstract thing of what it is to be anything at all. So I think when you see that, right, when you see things being discussed at such a high level of generality, chances are, I'm not going to say this is 100% way to tell, but chances are you have stumbled upon philosophy, right? I think that's a good way, if not of defining philosophy, at least a good way of spotting it when it's happening. Now, I also want to say it's a good opportunity to mention this. Stipulating a precise definition instead of just a general characterization, the way I've just done, I think it's not only difficult to stipulate a precise definition. I also think it's actually bad philosophy. And the reason for that is that the concepts in our minds, such as the concept of philosophy, are things that have developed over time as part of the evolutionary process. These are things that have developed in our minds rather messily through history, through trial and error, through use. And so they are not actually things that we should expect to be perfectly precise, right? That kind of messy historical process tends not to create perfectly bounded concepts. It tends to create generally useful concepts that tend to be fairly fuzzy at the borders. So I think if we were to stipulate a precise definition for philosophy and then talk about that, in a sense, we would not be talking about the actual phenomenon of philosophy, which is, again, a fairly vague, kind of fuzzily bounded one. So for that reason, I actually don't think it's even a worthwhile enterprise to try to put forward a precise definition of what philosophy is. But again, I'm counting on the fact that you know exactly what I'm talking about, even though we may not be able to define it precisely. And before moving on, I want to sort of note that the argument that I just gave for why I shouldn't be stipulating a precise definition is a great example of a philosophical argument. It doesn't necessarily have to be a good one. You can disagree with me on that, but it is the sort of thing that you see when you're looking at philosophy. Okay, so now that we have broadly what philosophy is when we're talking about why do philosophy, let me now address what kind of a question why do philosophy is and what kinds of answers we might be looking for. Like, what are the options in answering this question, why do philosophy? I want to specify what I mean by saying why do. So I think that there's two senses that can have. It can mean asking of an individual, say myself, why should I do philosophy? Why should you do philosophy? Why should she do philosophy? Or it can be a general question regarding maybe society as a whole. Why should society have the institution of philosophy? Why should people in general practice this field, the study of philosophy? Those are distinct, but by and large, as I've looked into what I want to say about why do philosophy, I tend to find that most of the answers to the question apply to both. I mean, generally, if there's a good reason for me as an individual to do something, then it's generally for similar reasons good for that institution to exist in society. And in certain places I'll mention where maybe this particular reason tends to apply more on an individual level, and this reason tends to apply more on a social level. But generally speaking, it'll apply to both. So the question, why do philosophy, I think, is like a question about why have any kind of, or practice, any kind of practice or institution. Why do architecture? Why do boxing? Etc. So I actually want to run through a couple of examples of the kinds of answers that other fields have. And I think certain other fields have easier answers. And that'll give us a clue for at least the type of answer we should be looking for. So if I ask, why do physics? Well, one easy answer is that doing physics tends to facilitate technological progress that tends to allow us to do all kinds of new things and generally improve standard of living. That's a great reason. Generally heavier on the social benefit than on the individual benefit. Another reason you might do physics, though, is just actually intellectual curiosity, which is, you're the kind of person that just wants to understand the nature of matter and motion. And so you want to study physics. Now, I think generally speaking, it is good for societies to have these kind of curious, inquiring institutions. But I think that one, you can see why it might fall a little bit heavier on the personal benefit side. Also, a little bit more strongly on the personal benefit side. Something else you might answer to the question of why do physics is actually just because it's beautiful. You hear physicists talk all the time about how they consider what they discover to be incredibly beautiful and elegant. And that might have something to do with, why you would practice physics. You can ask why have or practice religion. And, one answer to that might be that you want to make sure that your afterlife is the good kind. And so you want to follow whatever path will ensure that. It could be because you believe that there really is a creator who created you and had a particular purpose in mind. And so it is naturally the right and correct thing for you to discover that purpose and follow it so that you can do what you were meant to be done by your own creator. Assuming that you believe that, that's an extremely compelling reason to do something. Just one more example. Why do painting? One reason might be just because it's enjoyable. You like it. Another one might be because you feel compelled to excel at a craft. And painting is the one that comes most naturally to you. Or it could be because you really love the tradition of painting. You look at the historical tradition of painters and how they moved forward the medium, and you find it a kind of noble thing or something that you naturally desire to push forward that tradition. I wanted to put those out there again, just to give a sense of the kinds of answers that maybe we can have to the question of why do philosophy. Now I'm going to tip my hand and say what I think are the reasons to do philosophy. And I think there are three kinds, and I'm going to discuss all three of them in a bit more detail. But the three are competitive craftsmanship, a scientific sort of inquiry or curiosity, and spirituality. So let me go into the first one, competitive craftsmanship. So competitive craftsmanship has two components, the craftsmanship component and the competition component. I think of competitive craftsmanship, the competitive craftsmanship impulse to do philosophy, as being similar to the impulse that drives people to excel at games or to excel at art forms. And so, yeah, it's got these two components, craftsmanship and competition. The craftsmanship part is the desire to master a craft. Okay? And then the competition part serves a couple of purposes. One, you test your mastery of the craft through competition with other people who do the same practice. And then there's also actual intrinsic benefits to competition as well that don't just come from the fact that they benefit the craftsmanship side. So when I talk about craftsmanship as being a reason that you do philosophy, the craft here is the art of argumentation, specifically argumentation about philosophical topics, or you might say argumentation about highly general and abstract topics. Argumentation is really key here. So arguments are what we do philosophy with. You know, they are the ball in basketball. They are the painter's paintbrush. Arguments are the primary tool and medium through which we engage in philosophy. But also, there's also a really important sense in which great arguments are also the goal, right? If you craft a beautifully compelling argument with that addresses all the many potential objections, addresses them well, there's no obvious fallacies, right? Then you have crafted this beautiful argument, and in a large sense, that's your goal as a philosopher. You want it to be convincing enough that I suppose, you want it to be such a good argument that I suppose the other side is convinced, but so much of that is really just the craft of putting together a beautiful, compelling argument. So that, in that is the art, I consider, of philosophy, and that's really what I'm referring to when I say craftsmanship. Notice that in order to master this art of crafting beautiful arguments, you need to know, first of all, you need to have all kinds of facts. You need to have enough awareness of the full philosophical tradition and the kinds of arguments that have been made before. You need to be well sort of placed in that whole world in order to be able to use it and respond to the various things that have been said and talked about. You also need to have a good grasp of logic and proper reasoning. Those are not necessarily always the same. You need to have a good grasp of rhetoric, right? Not just of what follows from what type of argumentation, but also how do you structure arguments so that they are as compelling as they possibly can be. That's rhetoric, and that's extremely important to philosophy. You also need to have a certain intuition that you can use in the right way in your philosophical arguments. And of course, this has sort of been covered already, but you need to have a good grasp of argumentative norms. What are those, right? What are the norms that people are actually arguing with? So now let me say a little bit about the competition side of this competitive craftsmanship impulse. So the competition side is, it's fairly intuitive, right? You compete with other people crafting arguments and in the sort of traditional understanding of an argument between two people, there's usually a winner, right? You think of it like a debate. Who won the argument? And I want to point out that I think that philosophy is formally well suited to competition. The way it's actually set up kind of structurally as a practice, it is dialogical. It involves two or more opposing positions, right? So even if you're practicing philosophy by yourself, you're writing an article, you're writing a book, whatever, what is one of the main things that you do? Well, you try to anticipate objections and you respond to them. You're always kind of pretending that you're engaged in an argument with somebody else, even if you happen to be doing philosophy by yourself. So I think the form of philosophy makes it inherently a competitive kind of craft. Not all crafts are like this, right? So I think painting is actually a great example of an art form that you can excel at the craft and maybe not care so much about how what you're doing measures up to what other people are doing. I think a lot of painters do care. They're maybe invested in the tradition, and they're invested in how other people are furthering the tradition, and they have strong feelings about what they're doing being the proper way of furthering some tradition. But you don't have to be that way. As a painter, you can really just kind of do it, on your own, pretend you've never seen a painting before in your life. And I think that is a lot more possible than in philosophy, where in philosophy, you really have to at least pretend that there's somebody holding the opposing view. I want to say something else about competition. I think sometimes people have a negative connotation with competition because they see it as people being kind of like against each other in conflict. But really, I think of the way competition works, certainly in the realm of philosophy, as being competition only within the context of the game. So if we look at whatever topic it is that we're discussing, we're having an argument about, right? Look at that as a game, and we're both sort of making moves with our arguments against each other, right? Trying to prove the other one wrong. Well, we're competitors within the context of the game. However, if you broaden the context and make it not just within the game, but just the context of life, the context of what we're doing as two people, we're really collaborating. We're collaborating by engaging in this sort of pretense in which we're against each other and competing. But really, we're collaborating. Well, in what way are we collaborating? We are helping each other to test our positions, right? So one thing as a philosopher, if you feel strongly about a position, you want it to withstand as many attacks as possible. So you need somebody's help, right? You need to, hey, attack this thing as strongly as you can so that I can see what I need to do to it in order to have it withhold strong attacks. Right, so that's like, yeah, I'll help you, you help me. Let's attack each other's arguments because that's actually good for our positions. And not only is that good for positions, but it's also good for me as a craftsman to have another good craftsman kind of attack me with his craftsmanship. Right, that in dealing with that is the training that you go through in order to get better at your practice. And then finally, and this especially if you are really top-notch competitors, right? Your very competition, by having it, you are furthering the tradition, right? So there's this philosophical tradition of arguments that have been made by great philosophers for thousands of years, right? So if you're a really top-notch philosopher, and you're engaged with another top-notch philosopher, well, what are you doing? You're writing philosophical history by having the argument that you're having. That's another way in which you collaborate. You're collaborating on this debate that is, a piece of philosophy history. I want to say that tradition thing that I sort of emphasize in this last point, I think is really important because generally speaking, people who care strongly about a craft generally care strongly about the tradition of that craft. Not always the case, but generally, if you're a painter, you probably have strong feelings about the great painters. Maybe some of them you'd think are not so great, and some of them you think are underrated, and there's some who you feel like what you are doing is kind of taking what they did and moving it to a new level, Oftentimes great artists, and I'm using artists in the broadest sense here because, in talking about this craftsmanship side, I'm basically talking of philosophers as artists. Great artists often, and, their great contributions often end up being made in response to somebody that really deeply influenced them. So in the world of philosophy, one thing you see a lot is philosophers who are clearly very heavily influenced by some philosopher, and then they make their major contribution by turning away from their mentor philosopher in some important sense. Okay, so Quine really makes some of his most important contributions to philosophy in the process of turning away from Carnap, who is in many senses his mentor, right? You see the same thing with Heidegger turning away from Husserl. And there's many examples. Actually, Aristotle turning away from Plato is how he first kind of moves into a lot of his terrific contributions to the history of philosophy. Another thing I want to say about this competitive craftsmanship thing is that you're getting training in essentially abstract argumentation. Now, if you love the craft and the tradition, then you do it just for its own sake. But there's also this carryover benefit where you're generally just getting training in making better arguments about general topics. I think that has fantastic carryover benefits. I think it makes you generally better at questioning things in general, at being an independent thinker. Also, the fact that philosophy tends to be such a quagmire, the fact that philosophical questions tend to, and more often than they get solved, they proliferate into bigger and bigger questions and sub-questions, and I think is actually extremely useful for maneuvering just everyday life, for maneuvering the kinds of choices that we have to make in life. You have to often deal with that kind of proliferation of complexity and uncertainty. And I think that engaging in philosophical argumentation is fantastic training for that. So, aside from just the inherent value of participating in a craft, you do get some general great sort of life skills that come with that aspect. One more general point that I want to make about the craftsmanship side of philosophy. If you think of it as a game where you master this art of arguing about abstract things, you need to ask, what are the rules of the game? Specifically, how do arguments get evaluated? Right. So I said that the craft here is creating beautiful and compelling arguments. Okay. Who decides what counts as beautiful and compelling in an argument? That question is itself a really complicated philosophical question, right? So look, if you're playing chess and you have a question of you want to evaluate a move, well, if you want to evaluate how good a move it was, maybe that can be kind of complicated. But if you want to just evaluate whether it's a good move, the rules are extremely clear. There's never any controversy there. In philosophy, that's not the case, right? So in philosophy, there are issues in logic, in epistemology, in philosophy of language that make what the rules of the game are a subject for debate. And actually, there's even things in metaphysics, in aesthetics, in philosophy of mind, in ethics that can really complicate, what moves you're allowed to make in philosophical argumentation. So what that means is that the very rules that we use to evaluate the game of philosophy is an arena for the game of philosophy. Which means that philosophy is this sort of ever morphing practice whereby it's never, it's not stable, because whatever it is at any given moment, right, you can use its own methods, right, its own argumentative methods of inquiry and evaluation on itself, right? And when you do that, the result may change, right? What emerges may be a slightly modified rules of the game version of philosophy. But now this new modified version is also subject to its own kind of self-inquiry. And in that way, because the rules of the game are themselves always up for grabs in this competitive craftsmanship arena, the practice has this kind of interesting, unstable structure to it. inherent in what I just said, notice, is self-reference, right? So there's a sense in which the rules of the game of philosophy get applied to themselves. Notice that there's also this kind of regress, right? So philosophy gets sort of self-modifies. Out comes some new version of philosophy, and now that has to self-modify again, and that you can see that process would continue over time. So there's this implication of regress as well. And notice also that there is this form that gets subjected to itself, right? So you have a formal process turned into a kind of object that process gets applied to. Right? So we normally are dealing with philosophy as a process, as these argumentative techniques or rules that you use on subject matter, right? But then you take this process and you now treat it as an object that the very process gets to act on, right? So it's this sense in which there's this kind of form and content dichotomy that gets broken down, where the form becomes a content for itself. I mention this because these ideas, form becoming its own content, self-reference, and regress, are areas that I find to be some of the more kind of fundamental themes that pop up in philosophical problems everywhere. And when I do my second part, in which I discuss my own philosophical outlook, these guys will play a major role. So I'm bringing it up, I guess, to show the way in which my own philosophical outlook is really coming in to inform my view of what philosophy is. You can see how these patterns that arise just from looking at the nature of practicing philosophy pop up in just throughout my overall kind of philosophical outlook when we look at actual particular issues, not just what is philosophy or why do philosophy. In fact, I think a very good reason why I'm obsessed with things like the liar paradox and with the Agrippan trilemma, and I've done, podcasts and articles on both of those topics a lot, is because both of them, if you look at them, really exemplify these patterns of self-reference, regress, and form kind of become content. I don't want to dive into that very specifically right now. I'll mention it again in the second part and kind of dive a bit more into them there. Notice also that this creates a grounding problem. So if you notice, the fact that the rules by which we evaluate philosophy get to apply to apply to themselves, which tends to actually modify those rules, means that we don't seem to have starting rules, right? So another thing that pops up right there is a problem of grounding. And so right along with regress, self-reference, and the form and content issue is the issue of grounding, which I consider to be equally fundamental, and also very much involved in the Agrippan trilemma and the liar paradox that I just mentioned as examples. Okay, the next component that I mentioned was scientific inquiry or curiosity. So before diving into it, I want to make a quick observation about another interesting theme, let's say, and that is that if you look at the dichotomy between treating philosophy as a practice of primarily scientific-like inquiry versus looking at it as a kind of game or art form, I think you see there the broad dichotomy of creating versus discovering. And this is another dichotomy that I notice pop up a lot. And it's really fundamental to philosophy. So a lot of times we ask questions like, is meaning created or discovered? Is the good created or discovered? Is the truth created or discovered? When we're doing philosophy, what are we doing? Are we discovering the truths about, the universe and the world in our mind, blah, blah, blah? Or are we kind of creating that? Are we sort of creating these narratives about what that is like? That's a lot more like drawing a picture than uncovering something that was hidden. And so, I think that dichotomy very much applies to this issue of scientific inquiry versus craftsmanship. So this scientific, you could also look at it as kind of mathematics, inquiry component. I think it's fairly straightforward and compelling. It's you want to find out the truth about the world, and certain kinds of truths count as philosophical truths. And when you're doing philosophy, you're trying to get those. It's fairly straightforward. I think there's two reasons you might want to do that. Again, this scientific inquiry also breaks down into two kind of subcomponents. One is just curiosity, right? It's just that you want to know, just because you want to know. And then another is because you want to improve the world, because you think that finding out the truth about the world philosophically is going to help in some way make the world better. Let me go into both of those in a little bit more detail. So there's an objection to the idea that you can use philosophy to satisfy your curiosity about the world. And that objection is, look, philosophy has failed utterly at being progressive. If you're a scientist, then you'll notice that when we learn things, we keep those things that we learn and we then use them to learn more, and those things that we learn compound. And so while there may be controversies in the sciences at any given moment, generally speaking, over time, those controversies actually get settled and we get new controversies, as opposed to getting stuck in the same kind of philosophical quagmire where we're still trying to answer some of the same questions that, Aristotle was trying to answer thousands of years ago. Another, not exactly the same, but kind of related objection might be, look, philosophy has never really been able to solve these skeptical dilemmas, right? It's never really been able to satisfactorily deal with something like the Agrippan trilemma. It's never really been able to establish any kind of grounds for certainty. So maybe instead of trying to find ways around that, maybe instead of trying to find ways that those skeptical arguments are wrong, we should just acknowledge that the very practice that we're engaged in is actually just not a very good one, right? Maybe the problem is not specifically with the skeptical arguments, which, we can't really accept because they're self-defeating, right? We can't accept that we don't know anything because then we don't know even that. And we have to kind of accept that nothing that we really say has any force whatsoever. And that just seems absurd. So instead of assuming that there must be something we have missed and continuing to fight the skeptical arguments, we should just accept that actually the philosophical way of thinking and inquiring actually doesn't have much scientific use. And there's a pretty good story that might come along with that objection, which is similar to the story that I gave earlier about why we shouldn't be stipulating precise philosophical definitions. A precise definition for philosophy. And that is that our concepts are tools. And these tools evolved over time for a purpose. That purpose being ease of communication between human beings. And when we then hypergeneralize those tools and start to ask kind of questions about them that was not really what they were kind of designed for, let's say. You can't make a coherent worldview out of what you get. And we shouldn't be surprised. That's not what these concepts were meant to do. They were not, there was no evolutionary imperative for this kind of precise, coherent, and highly abstract picture of the world. There's an evolutionary imperative for a clear and useful communication on specific problems that human beings may be working on. So the force of these objections is that, what they kind of suggest is that philosophy is never going to get anywhere. It's going to be always this quagmire of schools of thought trying to answer old questions in new ways, finding out that there were problems with that, and it's never really going to get beyond that. As a note, you might add that, look, philosophers have been aware of this problem, the fact that philosophy is not terribly progressive, that it hasn't met the standard of science. This was actually Kant's big goal, right? Kant's big goal was to put philosophy on that footing with the sciences. And, his attempt was so impressive that it essentially earned him the reputation of being the greatest philosopher since Aristotle. And yet it's still pretty clear that he failed. So that should be pretty disheartening, right? Like, maybe we should just get the hint. So there's a couple of different responses that can be said, that can be thrown against these types of objections. One is that the sciences are not perfectly progressive. We do discover from time to time that things that we thought we knew in the sciences were not quite right. There's the whole kind of Kuhnian story about scientific revolutions, which I think tends to maybe get overemphasized in these kinds of discussions, but are important to keep in mind. Science is not, in fact, perfectly progressive. It's also not true that philosophy is not progressive at all. It is somewhat progressive. Some questions do, in fact, get answered, and you do achieve a certain level of near mathematical certainty on some issues. I think the most obvious example there is the progress that's been made in philosophical logic in the 20th century. It's just absolutely terrific and has that level of kind of mathematical certainty that I think counts as real progress. The most important response, I think, to those series of objections is that there's a funny thing that happens with philosophy and science, which is that if you look at the history of it, I'm not saying this is a perfect analysis, but I think it generally maps. When you have a philosophical question or philosophical subcategory in which we do achieve something like scientific levels of progress, that subcategory of philosophy tends to be relabeled a science, a separate science from philosophy. So, all of the sciences, as far as I can tell, I'm sure maybe there are exceptions, but as far as I can tell, all of the sciences were once considered to simply be a branch of philosophy. Certainly that goes for physics, and biology, down to psychology and computer science. Philosophy, in some sense, can be said to be progressive in that way that when it does reach a pretty good place with a particular set of questions, it lets those questions fly away and be their own subject. So in a way, because philosophy works that way, it's always going to seem like philosophical questions never get anywhere. Because once they do, they stop being philosophical questions. With all that being said, I also think it's important to say that those objections make a great point. I actually don't think that philosophy is a great tool for scientific or mathematical type of inquiry. It has some value, but I actually don't think a lot. And I do think that the broadest philosophical questions the broadest kind of ontological questions and epistemological questions will probably never become a science. We'll never achieve that kind of level of scientific certainty or progress. I could be wrong, of course, but I do think that those objections, precisely because of those objections, are actually right. Because our conceptual tools were not really designed to withstand what we do to them when we practice philosophy, that level of hyper-generality, hyper-abstraction. It's not what they were designed for. I basically think that, and this is an insight that you see in a number of philosophers, Kant and Wittgenstein come most obviously to mind, which is that there's something about the nature of reality itself that is ineffable. There's something about the fact that when we ask about the world itself, we're asking about something that is not itself conceptual, not itself linguistic, and yet we have to use conceptual tools and linguistic tools in order to talk about those things. And so that there's always going to be, in some sense, something lost in translation. I think that this insight is fairly fundamental and impossible to get beyond. Again, Kant and Wittgenstein sort of draw it out in different ways, but that general idea that you can maybe picture the thing, but you're not going to picture the picture making process, in such a way that you can then kind of subtract it out and get the real thing. That doesn't seem to actually be 100% possible. And so there's always going to be some way in which, when you hyper generalize in this way, you're just going to get lost in some kind of loop. So look, I think it's important for me to say that here I really diverge with a lot of other people, right? So people who are less skeptical than I am about the possibility of philosophical progress, people who are just generally less skeptical than I am, period, might, and many I think do, feel much stronger about wanting to pursue philosophy out of curiosity, out of wanting to learn about the world. For somebody as skeptical as I am, that particular impulse it's much slower. That is not one of the main reasons that I do philosophy, and I'm quite skeptical that it really has that value. I think it's important to mention in this context that Quine had this. It's funny because Quine is really one of my top favorite philosophers, and yet on this point, I'm so much the exact opposite of him. He really saw philosophy as a branch of science, just a particular type of science that was involved with kind of clarifying ontological frameworks that then science can... Essentially, I think he saw philosophy as science as like clarification buddy. Let me put your concepts in order so that you can go ahead and use them in the real sciences. But he saw that as basically part of a scientific enterprise. And I don't think that there's much strength to that outlook, if for no other reason, because it doesn't seem to me like actual scientists see it that way. It doesn't seem to me like scientists really care what philosophy has to offer. There are certainly exceptions, maybe important ones, but generally speaking, it seems like science gets along pretty well without caring that much about what philosophy has to say. And I think that by itself, just the empirical evidence of that, I think it's pretty good indication that Quine probably overplayed that. So all of this means that I do have a certain irony about practicing philosophy, because the form of philosophy is that you seek answers to questions, right? That's what arguments are. What are arguments about? They're about questions that you have about the nature of reality or the nature of what have you. And you investigate those like you're trying to find out the truth. If you're like me, and that in this kind of scientific inquiry side of the philosophical impulse isn't very strong with you, then you're going to do that somewhat ironically, right? You're going to do it like there's a sort of pretense. You do it, you play the game to your best of your ability, you come up with the best possible argument you can, but then at the end of it, what you've got is a philosophical argument that's, a compelling philosophical argument for its own sake, maybe for that craftsman kind of value. But you don't take super seriously what it's actually telling you about the world. I would say that that's the case for me, and probably for many other philosophers who are as skeptical as I am. It also means, by the way, so part of why you pursue this kind of knowledge isn't only for curiosity, but because it helps with things like technological progress. I mentioned that about physics earlier. And I'm also very much skeptical that, by doing philosophy, you're going to eventually help science in such a way that eventually it's going to help technological process and improve the quality of people's lives. Good luck. I don't think so. But there is that second component of this scientific inquiry, big umbrella, which is that you want to improve the world. Now, the way to improve the world isn't just by improving technological progress, which again, I don't think philosophy really helps to do. But you might say, hey, by getting some important truths about, let's say, ethics or political philosophy, most obviously, you can improve the world, right? If you can find out the truths about how to live your life or how to structure society, that can actually really improve the world. I think the most obvious objection to that, aside from the objection that's already been stated, which is that science hasn't been very progressive in the realm of ethics or politics either. But aside from that, there's the very serious problem of the fact that, let's say you do, despite all odds, come up with a fantastic ethical system that if people followed it would really improve the quality of their lives. You haven't done anything that suggests that they will actually follow it. So if your goal in doing philosophy is to improve the world, then you're going to need some reason to think that the philosophy you've done is actually going to make an impact. Generally speaking, you make that kind of impact by penetrating cultural institutions. And it doesn't seem to me like just, you do philosophy and it enters cultural institutions. If you build it, they will come. That doesn't seem to really be the case. So if you want to really pursue that, and I think it's reasonable to do so, in fact, it's not a huge part, but a part of why I do philosophy is to improve the world. You need to have in mind, I think, one of two things. One possible way you could sort of do that is to actually do it because you either intend to then market your philosophy yourself, or because you hope that by creating this philosophy, you then make it available for somebody who's a great marketer, who will be convinced by your arguments and then use his ability to penetrate cultural institutions to take your positions and bring them out into popular culture and have people actually live by them. So I think two great examples are Marx, who did himself a decent job of marketing his own views, but then other people since Marx have done an incredible job of taking his views and kind of injecting them into cultural institutions in a way that has made Marxism one of the most influential intellectual developments in history. And, Marx didn't do that himself, but by creating the philosophy in the first place, he made it possible. Another great example is Chomsky, who is a really fantastic marketer for his own philosophy, right? So it seems to me like he quite genuinely is doing what he's doing because he really wants to improve the world. And he's taken it upon himself to be the best advocate for his own ideas. And he's done, not that he's penetrated popular culture. He's not competing with, Beyonce or whoever dominates popular culture these days. But relatively speaking, he's doing a pretty great job. So it can be done. It's hard. I think it's just important to remember that philosophy is not activism. So if your main goal is really to improve the world, you need to have some kind of idea about how your philosophy then meets activism such that that can actually happen. And then there's another thing you could do, which doesn't have to do so much with marketing and penetrating cultural institutions, but maybe it's just the hope that, not that your philosophy will become mainstream, but that there will be isolated individuals, isolated curious individuals who, as part of their own kind of journey of inquiry, will run into your work and be personally and individually affected, such that even if you never break it into the mainstream, you still make a difference for this select group who you kind of intimately impact and move. And, maybe you hope those are the kind of people that make a big impact on the world. But even if not, there may be value in itself just in reaching these few. And I think that that's fairly compelling. It's limited enough that I'm skeptical of it being the main reason you do philosophy, but I think it's perfectly fine. Okay, and then the third big umbrella, spirituality. So with spirituality, I think spirituality is an interesting one because it kind of has components of the competitive craftsmanship side and components of the scientific inquiry side. It can be creative the way that the craftsmanship can be. It's very, personal and creative in that way. But it also involves kind of asking questions in the way that the scientific inquiry side is. And yet it's very much its own thing, right? And so spirituality, again, I'm not going to go into some kind of big dive into what it is. Just call it the need for finding a purpose to life, or situating your life in some kind of higher purpose or meaning. Again, I think of this as just a thing that people do, as a component of human life that I think everybody in some sense or another is plagued with dealing with. And you can deal with it in a number of different ways. You can really dive into religion if that really, fits with your disposition and your beliefs. If you're like a highly skeptical kind of person, then maybe your spiritual needs are largely satisfied by science, and that's all you really need. For others, maybe it's not so answering questions, and for some people, really the spiritual drive gets answered by just doing good. That's something that you see a lot. I think if you're the kind of person who's very skeptical, but also you have this need for utmost generality, then you'll probably get dropped off in the philosophy sector of the spiritual quest. So one immediate objection might be, like, just spirituality is like a wooey thing with like supernatural connotations, nothing to do with philosophy. Like, get that stuff out of here, man. Despite what you've said, philosophy is a lot more like science than like religion. Get out of here. And I think that basically this objection is just historically misinformed. The vast majority of philosophers throughout history have felt that their work was heavily tied to their religious concerns. I mean, before a certain time, fairly recently, almost all philosophers really seem to be, to feel the need to square their philosophy with their religion and often bring them together in an important way. Even once you start getting atheist philosophers, either their atheism is a huge part of their philosophy, or even despite the fact that they're atheists, they still have a certain strong spiritual kind of disposition. I think the most obvious example there for both of those points is Nietzsche. Clearly an atheist, but then also so clearly to me involved in a spiritual concern, finding, or in his case, really creating a purpose for your life. Generally, I think the existentialists, some of them were Christians, but the existential, even the ones who were atheists, I think seem to be so obviously spiritual philosophers. I do think it is possible to do philosophy without the spiritual component. I just don't think it's the norm. I think, generally speaking, if we look at the broad practice of philosophy, it's obviously a huge component, a defining component. Yes, some people, I do think, succeed at doing great philosophy without being particularly spiritually concerned. But I don't think it's the norm. I actually do think it's a kind of a historical hiccup that the 20th century kind of analytic tradition tended to really bypass some of, in some cases, try to bypass some of the spiritual implications of philosophical inquiry. But again, I don't think that reflects the practice overall. And I think in a lot of cases that just happened to be because the people practicing happened to be people who put their need for spiritual satisfaction into their belief in science. Now, you might ask, okay, well, put the objection aside, why would philosophy have anything to do with spirituality? And I think that the answer to that is fairly obvious. If you just look at the perennial philosophical questions, what is the nature of truth? What is the nature of the world? What is the nature of my mind? What is the nature of beauty? Do I have choice? What is the grounding of the world? These are all questions that very obviously are relevant to spiritual concerns, to finding a purpose or meaning to your own life. Now, you might object the other way and say, philosophical inquiry is just way too abstract and intellectual a pursuit to really fulfill what a spiritual life is supposed to be like. And I think there's something to that objection. I just would respond that, spirituality, I think, is a big part of philosophy, and philosophy can be a big part of spirituality for somebody who has the right kind of disposition, but it is not exhaustive of spirituality. If you're somebody who really cares about spirituality, then you're probably, then things like doing good, love, conviction, faith, intuition, a lot of these things that maybe don't play a huge role in philosophy are also going to be really important to finding the purpose of your life, finding value in your own life. But philosophical answers, or even just the process of looking for philosophical answers to those questions, can be really insightful, can be relevant, can be a part of your overall spiritual way of life. I mean, that's very much the case for me, right? First of all, as I said, I'm very skeptical of philosophy's ability to actually answer questions concretely. But I think that in the process of looking for those answers, I get insight into my own spiritual being, and I use those in conjunction with my relationships and my choices and what I consider to be the power of love and things like that come together to form a full spiritual way of being. So let me now sum up and also apply some of these a bit more personally, because I've only done that a bit, and I want to tie in specifically how some of these broad points that I've made apply to what I'm doing. So as I mentioned, I think there's three broad components to why somebody might do philosophy: competitive craftsmanship, scientific-like inquiry, and spirituality. So for the competitive craftsmanship is, for me, I think the most important. I just love this game. I love beautiful arguments and compelling arguments. I love understanding them, and I love creating them. And that's a huge part of why I do what I do. I basically see myself as being in a training, in a kind of self-imposed school, where I'm trying to learn and master this craft. And so, by doing things like, for example, interviewing philosophers, I get to see a little bit of how they think, what they're interested in, I get to ask them questions that I actually have about their work. And all of that helps for me in this training process of improving my craft. There's, I also, by present, I don't only interview philosophers, I also present solo arguments like I'm doing now, and I write. And again, that's really all about testing and improving my mastery of the craft. And then also, as I mentioned, there's this sort of side benefit of the fact that I think that just getting better at abstract reasoning has all kinds of carryover benefits into other areas of life. I also, as I mentioned, so that was kind of more on the craft side, but the competitive side as well. I do love competitive games, and so I think that obviously by doing all of this training, I do get better at being able to compete. But I also do hope to invite people to engage me in this kind of pretense competition that is really a collaboration. I want to engage with people's objections, and I want to get into arguments with people in that broad sense of the word, and play this game. As I mentioned, I am fairly skeptical of the ability for the scientific inquiry side to really provide answers. So that kind of curiosity about the truth, let's say, is not for me a huge component. However, the side of that's about improving the world does have some pull for me. Not huge, but there's some. I would be extremely happy to know that there were some isolated individuals who discovered my work and found it inspiring, or found it interesting, or that it impacted their life or their way of looking at the world in some way. Similarly, I do think that my views are good views to have. That's why I have them. So I do want to sort of spread my philosophy. And that means that I do like the idea of of either somebody discovering my work and promoting it in some way into popular culture, just as I like the idea of being able to do that myself. And I'm fairly early on in this process, and so I don't think I've developed my philosophy well enough to make any real attempt at, quote, promoting it into culture, quote. But certainly I'm doing some of that by broadcasting, right? By not just doing this privately. And that is because I want to test this stuff. And I also, as it gets better with testing, I do want to spread it. So that's not a huge pull for me, but it is there. And I do think that, let's say concerning my various views, but certainly my views on political philosophy and ethics. Sure, I do think if a lot of people encountered them and decided to implement them in their own lives, we'd probably have a better world. And then that third component, the spirituality, I think I explained it pretty well, so I don't have much else to say about it. It is, for me, doing philosophy and sharing philosophy, participating in that practice with other people, is an important part of my ongoing broad spiritual development. And there's one more thing that I want to address before I kind of sign off. And that is, you might ask, all right, even if all of these are your goals, that makes sense. There's a fairly standard path for doing this, which is that you go to grad school, you get a PhD, you become a professor. So you might ask, why am I not doing that? The answer has a couple of components. One is issues with the academic institution today, the university kind of system that dominates academia, in particular philosophy. I don't so much have huge problems with the way it operates in itself. I have problems with the fact that it is so much a single system. So the system of degree granting institutions is kind of this insular system, and it's not subject to a great deal of competition. I mean, it's sort of implicit in this question, right? Like, if you want to be a serious philosopher, you're going to do that. You're going to go to grad school and become a professor. That's just what you do. And I think that all institutions and all practices improve against serious competition. That's part of what I talked about, improving craftsmanship through competition. So I would love to be able to engage, maybe even down the line, create serious alternatives to the university academia system, such that such that there's just greater competition and a greater deal of variety for how philosophy is learned, taught, both in terms of style and content and evaluation. Not to mention, as a sort of separate matter, the fact that the costs involved with the university system in general are something that I find fairly abhorrent and unnecessary. And so, part of that searching for alternatives is not just because competition is better for the practice itself, the tradition itself, but also because I do think more people will be able to practice it, and generally just with more integrity, if there isn't this huge money aspect to it. I want to again mention Nietzsche here. If you look at the way that philosophy is taught today, you would never get a Nietzsche out of that style. Out of how academia is academic philosophy is taught today. Maybe you would if somebody goes through that process and is just, a contrarian jerk and doesn't really like follow what they're taught. But if you were at all conform to that, to the academic style of teaching philosophy, you're never going to come out of Nietzsche. And that would be sad, because Nietzsche is one of the greatest philosophers we've ever seen. So that's kind of what I mean when I say that I think that the academic institution needs some competition in terms of how philosophical training is supposed to go. There's also the fact, I should say, that I just have a bit of a individualist disposition. It's just something that I've noticed about myself. I do tend to prefer to kind of do things my own way. So that's also partly there. I should say, though, that one thing that the academic establishment does extremely well is that it has a tradition, it has this institution of peer review, which has quite successfully created a high standard of rigor in philosophy today. And so when you decide to bypass this established academic institution, you kind of miss out on that, and you have to kind of look for other ways of fulfilling it, because I think it's an extremely important function. And I just want to say for that part that I don't think I have found a terrific alternative for that. I think when it comes to the function that peer review serves and the standard of rigor that exists in academic philosophy today, I do think by not participating in academia, I'm missing out on that, and that is a genuine loss, a significant trade-off to the work that I'm doing. And all I can really say to that is that I am actively engaged in looking for ways to fulfill those alternatives, but don't have any great answers there yet. So, this is an ongoing concern for me. Anyway, I will leave it at that. And again, this has been a kind of comprehensive look at why I do philosophy, specifically why I do philosophy. And for the second part, I will go into what my actual philosophical outlook is. Until next time. And that concludes today's episode of Who Shapes the Barber? Again, I'm William Nava. You can check out other episodes, as well as my other philosophical and artistic work at williamnava.com. And if you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, go to williamnava.podbean.com. Thank you so much for listening.